The story of the Ghost Army begins in the shadowed corridors of World War II, where intelligence and deception became as vital as bullets and bombs. By 1944, the Allies had gained momentum in Europe, yet the threat of German counterattacks loomed large. The battlefield was not just terrain and soldiers, it was perception, the very image of strength and weakness. Commanders understood that sometimes what the enemy saw was more dangerous than what was actually there. From this understanding, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, later known as the Ghost Army, was born. Unlike ordinary units, this army was not defined by tanks, artillery, or infantry. Its power lay in illusion, creativity, and psychological manipulation. Selected soldiers were not only trained in combat, but also in the arts, design, and engineering. Many were artists, sculptors, sound engineers, and designers, people who could turn imagination into instruments of war. These men were tasked with a mission that defied traditional military logic: to deceive, mislead, and manipulate the enemy, creating the appearance of overwhelming force where none existed. Training for the Ghost Army was rigorous, and unlike anything in conventional military instruction. Soldiers learned to build inflatable tanks that swayed in the wind like real machines, wooden artillery pieces painted to look authentic from a distance, and fake vehicles capable of tricking aerial reconnaissance. Sound engineers meticulously recorded the noises of marching troops, rolling tanks, and moving trucks, learning to broadcast them convincingly over miles of terrain. Every detail, from tire tracks to campfires, was studied and manipulated to create the illusion of a fully mobilized army. The soldiers quickly realized that their greatest weapon was the human mind, the ability to convince the enemy to believe what was false. It was a test of observation, timing, and performance. Infantrymen trained as actors, learning to march in precise patterns and to deploy their illusions with confidence. Engineers experimented with materials, testing how rubber, canvas, and paint could deceive binoculars and aerial cameras. Artists perfected the visual illusions, ensuring that every shadow, every reflection, and every movement appeared authentic from afar. Their work required ingenuity and creativity equal to that of any battlefield strategist. Preparation extended beyond the tools themselves. Soldiers rehearsed entire operations, coordinating movement, sound, and visual cues as if preparing for a theatrical performance. Inflatable tanks were moved across fields under cover of night, while sound systems played the rumble of artillery and mechanized units. The goal was always the same: to convince the enemy that they faced an enormous, mobile force, even when the Ghost Army numbered far fewer men and machines. Each exercise refined precision, timing, and the delicate interplay between appearance and reality. The command recognized the unique nature of these operations. They emphasized creativity and adaptability, allowing soldiers to improvise and respond to unexpected circumstances. Instructors challenged recruits to think like the enemy, to anticipate where the deception would be observed, and to craft illusions that would withstand scrutiny from planes, reconnaissance units, and patrols. Every detail mattered, from footprints in the dirt to the placement of dummy radio equipment. The success of their missions depended on both technical skill and psychological insight. As training continued, the men of the Ghost Army became masters of misdirection. They learned to anticipate enemy movement, timing their operations to create maximum confusion. Inflatable tanks would appear on a ridge as German reconnaissance planes passed overhead. Rubber artillery would be strategically placed near forests, suggesting the presence of heavy firepower. Sound recordings played over loudspeakers, simulating entire battalions advancing through the terrain. To the enemy, these tricks were indistinguishable from reality, each illusion carefully crafted to deceive, distract, and mislead. The birth of the Ghost Army represented a radical evolution in warfare. It demonstrated that victory did not always depend on brute force alone. It could be achieved through imagination, psychology, and meticulous planning. The unit blurred the lines between art and combat, performance and strategy, illusion and reality. Men who might have been painters or sculptors in civilian life found themselves at the center of operations that would shape the course of battles in Europe. Their work proved that ingenuity and creativity could be weapons as powerful as any cannon or rifle. By the time the Ghost Army was deployed to the European theater, its members carried not only the weight of a military mission, but also the responsibility of changing the enemy's perception. They were pioneers of deception, artists in service of war, and strategists in camouflage. Their training, experiments, and rehearsals had prepared them for the complex task of war by illusion, a challenge that demanded both courage and intelligence. In the days to come, their ingenuity would alter the outcome of operations, saving countless lives and demonstrating the extraordinary potential of the human mind in warfare. In the heart of Europe, during World War II, the battlefield was not defined solely by firepower or numbers, but by perception. The men of the Ghost Army understood this truth more profoundly than any conventional soldier. To them, every tree, every ridge, every shadow could be manipulated to create a narrative, a story that the enemy would believe. Their arsenal was unlike any other. Inflatable tanks that swayed convincingly in the wind, wooden artillery pieces that looked real from miles away, and rubber planes poised on fields to deceive observers above. Each piece was a carefully crafted illusion, an instrument designed not to destroy, but to convince. The inflatable tanks were marvels of engineering and creativity. Crafted from durable rubber, they mimicked the exact shape and proportions of Sherman tanks. From a distance, they cast shadows and reflected light as real vehicles would. Engineers designed them with attention to every contour, ensuring that even reconnaissance pilots peering through binoculars or cameras could not distinguish them from the genuine article. At night, these decoys could be quietly inflated in fields, placed strategically along ridges, or positioned near roads to simulate troop movements, giving the enemy the impression of a massive armored division advancing across the countryside. Wooden artillery pieces were equally effective. Constructed by skilled carpenters and painted to resemble real cannons, they were often arranged in firing positions, surrounded by dummy soldiers in static poses. From a distance, or in aerial photography, these weapons appeared fully operational, ready to deliver devastating fire. The men of the Ghost Army understood that the success of these illusions depended on consistency. Every shadow, every angle, every proportion had to be perfect. Even slight misalignment could betray the deception and compromise the mission. Sound played an equally vital role in these operations. Sound engineers recorded the rumble of tanks rolling over cobblestone, the clatter of trucks transporting troops, and the boom of artillery fire. These recordings were played over loudspeakers, strategically positioned along roads, forests, and open fields, creating the illusion of movement where none existed. A single, well-placed recording could convince an entire enemy division that armored forces were advancing, prompting retreats, miscalculations, and diversions. The coordination between visual and auditory deception transformed static decoys into dynamic illusions of a living, moving army. Even the smallest details were meticulously considered. Tracks were painted or imprinted in the soil to simulate vehicle movement. Campfires were lit with care to appear occupied. Tents were pitched to suggest troop concentrations, and even radio traffic was simulated to fool signal intelligence. Soldiers rehearsed these performances repeatedly, ensuring that every element of the deception worked in harmony. It was a blend of science, art, and psychology, the kind of preparation that allowed a handful of men to convincingly impersonate an entire division. The Ghost Army also employed inflatable planes and trucks. Rubber aircraft perched on fields and roads suggested airfields and logistical hubs, tricking enemy reconnaissance into overestimating the strength and scope of Allied operations. Inflatable trucks, positioned as if transporting troops or supplies, added depth to the illusion, making it appear that entire supply lines were in motion. Each piece was designed with a balance of realism and practicality, lightweight enough to move quickly, yet visually convincing from the air. Coordination was key. soldiers deployed in carefully choreographed sequences, timing the inflation of tanks, placement of artillery, and playback of sound recordings to create maximum impact. These operations were often conducted under enemy observation, requiring precision and discipline. Every action had to support the overall illusion, reinforcing the enemy's perception that a formidable force was present. Improvisation was also vital. When reconnaissance planes arrived unexpectedly, soldiers had to adjust positions, rotate decoys, and adapt sounds to maintain the deception in real time. The effectiveness of these tools became evident during key operations. German reconnaissance planes would spot what appeared to be heavily armed divisions, only to find, upon advancing, that the perceived threat was entirely fabricated. Inflatable tanks would occupy ridges, fake artillery would line roads, and sound recordings would echo through the valleys, creating the illusion of movement and readiness. The enemy often diverted resources, shifted defenses, and hesitated in response, all without realizing they had been outwitted by ingenuity and artistry rather than brute force. Training was as much about psychology as it was about mechanics. Soldiers studied the enemy's habits, understanding what would be convincing to observers from the air and from the ground. They considered angles, distances, lighting, and the natural movement of shadows. Engineers, artists, and sound technicians collaborated to ensure that each element complemented the others. Inflatable tanks reflected light like real metal. Wooden cannons cast appropriate shadows. Sound recordings carried naturally across terrain. The integration of all these details made the illusions almost impossible to distinguish from reality. By the time the Ghost Army moved into actual combat zones, their tools were perfected instruments of deception. Inflatable vehicles, wooden artillery, sound recordings, and careful environmental manipulation were no longer experiments. They were weapons. The combination of visual, auditory, and psychological tactics enabled a small, specialized unit to influence battles, protect advancing troops, and misdirect enemy forces. Their creativity became as lethal as any conventional armament, saving countless lives and redefining the possibilities of warfare. The tools of deception did more than mislead. They created opportunities. Entire operations were planned around the illusions created by the Ghost Army. Commanders could maneuver real forces with reduced risk, knowing the enemy was reacting to what they perceived rather than the truth. The ingenuity, patience, and skill that went into each deployment underscored a critical lesson. War is fought not only with bullets and bombs, but also with the imagination and intellect of those who dare to see beyond the obvious. Once deployed in the European theater, the Ghost Army became an invisible force capable of changing the course of battles without ever firing a shot. Their operations took them behind enemy lines, where the risks were immense, and the margin for error was razor-thin. Every deployment required meticulous planning. The placement of inflatable tanks, wooden artillery, rubber planes, and sound systems had to be synchronized to the precise movement of real Allied forces. The men knew that their success would be measured not in destroyed equipment, but in the illusions created, the enemy misled, and the lives preserved by their ingenuity. One of the most iconic missions unfolded in France shortly after the D-Day landings. The Ghost Army was tasked with convincing German forces that a large division was advancing along a vulnerable sector of the front. Inflatable Sherman tanks were transported under cover of night to hilltops and fields visible from aerial reconnaissance. Wooden artillery and fake trucks were positioned along nearby roads, while loudspeakers broadcast the distant rumble of advancing troops. Reconnaissance planes passed over at dawn, capturing images that convinced German command that a full division was ready to engage. As a result, German forces reinforced the wrong sector, leaving the real invasion route less defended, saving hundreds of Allied lives and securing a tactical advantage. In another operation near the Rhine, The Ghost Army executed one of their most audacious deceptions. Soldiers staged a full-scale mock camp, complete with tents, dummy soldiers, campfires, and radio transmissions. Inflatable vehicles were scattered across the landscape, each placed at angles designed to suggest depth and mass. Sound recordings of vehicles, trucks, and marching troops created the illusion of movement. German reconnaissance reported large troop formations, prompting hesitation and defensive maneuvers that allowed the real Allied forces to maneuver unchallenged. The precision of timing, attention to detail, and understanding of enemy psychology turned a handful of men into an entire division in the eyes of the enemy. Close calls were frequent. Reconnaissance planes often appeared unexpectedly, or German patrols would approach areas where decoys were deployed. Soldiers had to act quickly, moving inflatable tanks, repositioning fake artillery, and adjusting sound broadcasts to maintain the illusion. On more than one occasion, a single misstep could have exposed the deception, potentially putting the unit and nearby Allied forces at risk. Yet through discipline, ingenuity, and courage, the Ghost Army consistently executed flawless operations under immense pressure, turning risk into a calculated advantage. Their operations were not confined to visual tricks alone. The Ghost Army also used timing and movement to their advantage. Inflatable tanks were inflated just minutes before enemy observation, making it appear as if a real unit had suddenly arrived. Sound recordings were played in loops, synchronized with visual placement of decoys. Even terrain features, ridges, forests, and rivers, were incorporated into the illusion to enhance depth and realism. Enemy intelligence, relying on aerial photographs and sporadic ground reports, interpreted these deceptions as genuine, often overestimating the size and readiness of Allied forces by several divisions. Throughout these missions, the human element was critical. Soldiers acted as performers, engineers, and strategists all at once. Every step was choreographed, decoys positioned, sounds played, fake tracks laid, and patrol movements simulated. Observers from the enemy would see activity, hear noise, and capture images, all pointing to a force far larger and more threatening than reality. The ability to convince, mislead, and manipulate relied equally on discipline, creativity, and courage. The men of the Ghost Army were artists of war, blending psychology, engineering, and performance into a single instrument of strategic deception. The outcomes of these operations were staggering. Entire German units were misled into defending empty fields, deploying resources where no threat existed, and altering tactical decisions based on what was merely an illusion. Real Allied units advanced with reduced risk, encountering less resistance and gaining crucial time to secure objectives. Stories circulated of German commanders being baffled by phantom formations, mistaking inflatable tanks for battalions, rubber planes for airfields, and the echo of recorded artillery for real fire. These successes demonstrated that warfare was not only fought with weapons, but also with intelligence, ingenuity, and careful manipulation of perception. Despite the lack of traditional combat, the Ghost Army faced real dangers. Soldiers operated close to enemy lines, sometimes within small arms range, and their decoys could not protect them from direct fire or reconnaissance patrols. Improvisation and quick thinking were essential. On one occasion, a German scout approached a field of inflatable tanks. Soldiers had to blend decoys with their own presence, maintaining the illusion while avoiding detection. Such moments demanded bravery, adaptability, and an unyielding focus on the mission, illustrating that psychological operations were as perilous as any battlefield engagement. The impact of these missions extended beyond immediate tactical advantage. They demonstrated the power of perception in warfare, reshaping enemy strategies, slowing counterattacks, and enabling the Allies to capitalize on surprise and misdirection. Every operation validated the concept that illusion, when executed with precision and creativity, could achieve results that brute force alone might not. The Ghost Army transformed the very nature of engagement, showing that the mind could be a battlefield as critical as any hill, river, or town. As the Ghost Army continued to deploy across France, Germany, and Belgium, their reputation grew, though largely in secrecy. Few knew the identities of these men or the specifics of their operations, for the missions were classified. Yet the effects were tangible. German forces were frequently misdirected. Real Allied advances succeeded with reduced casualties, and countless lives were saved by deception rather than combat. The Ghost Army's operations became a testament to innovation, courage, and the subtle power of perception, proving that even in the chaos of war, the human mind and creativity could shape history. Behind every inflatable tank, every wooden cannon, and every recorded rumble of mechanized troops, there were men who embodied courage, creativity, and ingenuity in equal measure. The Ghost Army was not merely a unit of deception. It was a collective of artists, engineers, and soldiers who risked their lives to manipulate perception and alter the course of battles. The human element, the minds, hands, and hearts of these men, was the true power behind every successful operation. The soldiers faced the paradox of being in constant danger without wielding conventional weapons. They moved behind enemy lines, often within range of patrols or artillery, knowing that exposure could mean death. Yet their mission demanded not the firepower of a division, but the precision of an artist. Every inflatable tank had to be positioned convincingly, every sound recording timed perfectly, and every decoy placed with the understanding of how it would be perceived from miles away. The soldiers were both performers and tacticians, actors on a stage of war where illusion could determine life or death. Collaboration was central to success. Artists worked alongside engineers, carpenters alongside military strategists, and sound technicians alongside infantrymen. This blend of skills created a synergy that allowed the Ghost Army to accomplish feats impossible for conventional units. An artist would paint shadows and highlights on a wooden cannon. An engineer would construct inflatable tanks that swayed naturally in the breeze. A sound technician would time the roll of recorded trucks so that enemy reconnaissance would perceive a full battalion advancing. Each contribution was crucial, and the coordination required discipline, trust, and a shared commitment to the mission. Improvisation was often necessary. Battlefields were unpredictable. Reconnaissance planes arrived unexpectedly, and terrain could differ from maps. Soldiers had to think on their feet, adjusting decoys, repositioning inflatable tanks, or altering sound playback to maintain the illusion. Quick judgment could save the mission, and ultimately, the lives of thousands of soldiers in the line of actual combat. The Ghost Army exemplify the principle of war rarely spoken. Adaptability, creativity, and courage could be as lethal as any weapon. Despite the extraordinary nature of their work, the men experienced fear, uncertainty, and the weight of responsibility. Being invisible yet exposed, they knew that a single misstep could betray the entire operation. Yet camaraderie, training, and confidence in their collective skill helped them endure the stress. Humor, art, and ingenuity became coping mechanisms, sustaining morale in tense situations. The soldiers learned to balance the psychological demands of their mission with the ever-present danger surrounding them. The human element extended to observation and psychological insight. Soldiers had to anticipate how the enemy would perceive their actions. How would a German reconnaissance pilot interpret the shadow of a tank in the early morning sun? Would a patrol officer notice a wooden cannon from the edge of a forest? The ability to think like the adversary, to predict their interpretations and assumptions, became a critical skill. It was not brute strength, but empathy, intelligence, and creativity that defined the Ghost Army's effectiveness. Personal stories illuminate the extraordinary bravery of these men. One soldier recounted hiding beneath an inflatable tank as a German scout passed by, heart pounding, knowing that a single discovery could unravel the mission. Another artist adjusted the shadowing on wooden artillery at dawn to ensure a realistic silhouette, even while artillery shells exploded in the distance. The work demanded patience, precision, and the courage to perform under the most stressful conditions imaginable. The Ghost Army also transformed how soldiers viewed themselves and their contributions. Success was measured not in enemy casualties, but in the successful execution of an illusion that would alter enemy behavior. They learned that impact could be achieved through intellect, artistry, and psychological insight. The men became pioneers, demonstrating that the human mind, carefully trained and creatively applied, could be a decisive force on the battlefield. Through every operation, the human element remained central. The skill, bravery, and coordination of the soldiers turned ordinary materials into instruments of strategy. Inflatable tanks swayed realistically in the breeze because of human hands. Sound recordings conveyed the roar of armored divisions because of human timing and insight. Each deception was a testament to the capacity of the human spirit to combine intellect, creativity, and courage in service of a larger purpose. The sacrifices were real, even if the battles were fought in illusion. Soldiers risked exposure, faced fatigue, and carried the weight of responsibility for the lives of others. Yet through it all, they demonstrated resilience, innovation, and bravery. The human element, the dedication, skill, and courage of each individual, transformed a small, specialized unit into a force that shaped outcomes far beyond its numbers. In the Ghost Army, history saw that warfare is not only about who fires the first shot, but also about who can shape perception, inspire fear, and outwit the enemy with imagination, discipline, and courage. The Ghost Army's operations remained classified for decades, shrouded in secrecy even as their impact quietly shaped the course of World War II. The men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops returned home without public recognition, their work known only to a select few within the military hierarchy. Yet the outcomes of their missions were undeniable. Through deception, misdirection, and ingenuity, they saved countless lives, misled enemy forces, and enabled real Allied units to achieve objectives with reduced risk. Their contributions demonstrated that warfare could be fought and won through intellect and creativity as effectively as through sheer firepower. Over time, historians and military analysts came to appreciate the significance of the Ghost Army. Their operations exemplified the strategic value of psychological warfare and tactical deception. Inflatable tanks, wooden artillery, rubber planes, and sound recordings were not merely props. They were instruments of strategy that directly influenced enemy decisions, diverted resources, and altered the battlefield landscape. The Ghost Army revealed that perception could be manipulated to produce real, tangible effects in combat, fundamentally changing the way military planners approached operational design. The legacy of the Ghost Army extends beyond the battlefields of Europe. Their methods laid the groundwork for modern military deception, camouflage, and psychological operations. Techniques pioneered by these men, such as using decoys, controlled misinformation, and environmental manipulation, continue to inform strategies in contemporary armed forces. Modern armies, intelligence units, and special operations teams draw lessons from their innovative approach, understanding that the mind of the enemy is as critical a target as their physical forces. Recognition for the Ghost Army arrived slowly. Decades after the war, veterans were invited to share their stories, and historians began to document their remarkable contributions. Exhibitions, books, and documentaries highlighted their ingenuity, bravery, and the unique nature of their service. The stories of artists turned soldiers, engineers turned strategists, and performers turned tacticians captivated the public imagination, bringing long overdue attention to a unit that had operated in shadows, yet whose influence was profound. The Ghost Army's impact also lies in the demonstration of human creativity under pressure. These men showed that unconventional thinking, applied with discipline and courage, could achieve outcomes that traditional methods might not. In a war dominated by machinery, bullets, and sheer manpower, they proved that imagination and intellect were equally vital instruments of victory. Their work illustrated a timeless lesson. Innovation and adaptability can turn the seemingly impossible into reality. Even today, the Ghost Army inspires reflection on the nature of warfare and human potential. They remind us that courage is not only measured by facing enemy fire, but also by taking responsibility for shaping outcomes through intellect, artistry, and precise execution. Their legacy challenges conventional definitions of heroism, showing that subtle, invisible acts of ingenuity can have consequences as significant as the loudest explosions of battle. The Phantom Division, though invisible in combat, left an indelible mark on history. Ultimately, the Ghost Army's story is one of vision, bravery, and the power of human ingenuity. Through the careful orchestration of illusion, they achieved what few could imagine, influencing battles without ever firing a single shot. They safeguarded lives, protected soldiers on the front lines, and shifted enemy strategies, all while remaining unseen and unrecognized. Their legacy endures, a testament to the extraordinary capacity of the human mind to turn creativity, courage, and intelligence into instruments of victory. The Ghost Army serves as a lasting reminder that the most powerful forces in war may not always be those that can be seen, but those that can be imagined, executed, and believed.